Foster Power is a movement to improve the lives and futures of youth in Florida's foster care system by creating access to information on their benefits, protections, and legal rights. Foster Power is the first app of its kind nationwide and was made by lawyers with youth input. Visit fosterpower.org/app to download the free mobile app today.
Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at safecampaudio on your social media. It is the final Monday before we get into the holiday season here in December, so it is time for our fourth annual best of episode here at the Imprint Weekly Podcast. Can't believe it's been 4 years. Year one was really just from September to December, so let's call it 3.5. But this is our fourth best of episode. I picked out 20 clips from some of our best interviews of the year. We're going to tee each one of those up. I'll kind of describe what's going on and play them for you. If any of these capture your intrigue, you can go to imprintnews.org/podcast. You can see our full archive there, and you can get the entire interview if you like. This is going to be our final episode for 2023, so we'll be on a little hiatus into early January, and we'll be back with a new episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast on the week of January 15th. Last thing before we get started here, I want to do one final appeal for our annual Newsmatch campaign. It's that time of year where nonprofit journalism organizations are looking to maximize giving through the Newsmatch program, and we are no exception to that. If you enjoy this podcast or the great work that our reporters do at the Imprint and Fostering Families Today, please consider making a donation. If you do so this month during Newsmatch, your donation will get doubled. Fostering Media Connections is very lucky to have some very terrific philanthropic supporters, advertisers, sponsors, subscribers to our business and policy section that I talk about at the beginning of every podcast. All of that helps to make this organization go, but we really cannot do it without donors like you who read our stuff, listen to the shows, attend our online events, and give even $5 or $10 gives an enormous difference in helping us to do what we do and do more of it. So one more time, it is Newsmatch season until December 31st. Your donation has doubled. If you give during that time, all you got to do is go to imprintnews.org/donate. All right, end of ask. So let's do this. Let's get into the top 20 clips from guest interviews during this year of episodes on the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm going in chronological order of the guests, so this is not ranking from 20th best to first or anything like that. We are going to start with Marina Nitza, who joined us. She is the author of Hack Your Bureaucracy, co-founder of the Child Welfare Playbook, which you should Google and check out. It's really an amazing bank of kind of best practices and ideas that she is helping to build. Marina's really a whiz. She just knows a ton about government and leveraging and hacking the bureaucracy, as her book title suggests. So we talked about a whole bunch of things when she came on. The clip you're going to hear is from an exchange that started with me making the comment that, we survey states every year now for some basic foster care data. One of those things being how many total licensed foster parents do you have or foster homes do you have? And I had made the observation to her that, by and large, you see a lot of media, kind of local media, that says we desperately need foster homes. We don't have enough foster homes. And while that may be true, and certainly is true in certain regions or with certain demographics of youth, the number of the total licensed foster homes, when you just add it up across the country, it has been above 200,000, and just only this year dropped below 200,000 for the first time since we've been tallying that. And Marina talked a little bit about how in the states that she has kind of drilled down to and consulted with and worked with, the issue is much more about who is fostering in terms of experience and observed that, while the number may be high enough or adequate enough in theory, lots of states that she has kind of gotten up close with are losing some of their more seasoned, experienced foster homes, and that can lead to some real problems. So here's Marina Nitza talking about that.
In the states where I have seen data, the number of foster parents may have seemed relatively constant over time, but the experience level of the foster parents is falling through the floor.
Oh,
so you're losing the families that, have been around for 10 or 15 years. And not only do those families tend to be better suited to help our kiddos with higher levels of need, but they're also a form of recruitment themselves, because they'll tell friends and family, and people will, interact with them in the community. And when you lose them, they are a reverse form of recruitment, because people are like, oh, why'd you stop fostering? And then they tell that story to the community. And the smaller your community is, whether you're maybe a county administered system or you're a smaller state, I think that can be especially painful. And part of that of the loop is really when states don't have enough of the families that kids really need, we burn those families out. You'll be like, oh my God, John, you did so great with this kiddo. They were unified with their parents this morning at 9:00. It's now 9:30. Would you like to take two more extremely challenging kiddos? When, we should be thinking about, do you need, grief therapy, or do you just need a break? Or maybe you want to do respite for a little while, or what other ways can we support you to stay in the game?
Okay. Next clip comes from my interview with Melissa Sickmund, who at the time that I had that interview with her was the director of the National Center for Juvenile Justice. And Melissa has been a longtime source and extremely helpful person to me in my career back when I was just starting up a juvenile justice beat. She is encyclopedic in her knowledge of historical trends and data and facts about states and how they run their juvenile justice systems. So the National Center has some big shoes to fill there. She has sunsetted into retirement to watch her beloved Pittsburgh Steelers play very mediocre football. She's going to laugh when she hears that. Okay, so this clip is Melissa talking about something really interesting to me, which is the idea of recidivism as a measure, not for youth involved in the system, but for the judges. And she's talking about, well, first, that she hates the term recidivism and suggests an alternative conceptual framework for that, but really gets into, what happened when she kind of put judges on the defensive and said, shouldn't you guys be held to account for how the young people who come through your court do? So here is Melissa Sickmund talking about that.
I can remember presenting about recidivism, which I hate that word, subsequent offending, to a room full of judges and asking them, is this a performance measure for judges? And they were like, no, why would it be? It's on the kid or on the program we sent them to. It's not on us. Why would it be on us?
Wow.
Well, but if you keep sending the kids to a program that doesn't work, doesn't that fall to you? And so I think, often when we talk with judges, there's a bunch of judges that we know that they love data. They want to see more and more. They use it well, but I don't think that that's common enough across the country. I would love to see more jurisdictions empowering their data people, have a data analyst on staff, and be able to have those data conversations with those key decision makers, because judges are smart people and they want to do good. They're not trying to do bad things. They want to have that kid have a successful life. They are not trying to cause harm, but without the right information, they may be making bad decisions.
Alrighty, clip number 3 comes from our interview with Bridget Mary McCormick, who at the time was the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court. And this was probably one of the more interesting situations that prompted an interview on the Imprint Weekly Podcast. So Judge McCormick, in one of the last child welfare cases that came to the Supreme Court in her time, and as you might imagine, for a child welfare case to come up to the eyes of the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, it's something that's in the appellate process. It's been appealed up. But she felt a certain kind of way about the way that the case went down and everything unfolded. And she basically used this appellate case and wrote the dissent herself. And in that dissent went well beyond just describing the problems that were inherent in the case at hand, in her opinion, but really used that dissent to really just sort of offer a structural takedown of the way that child welfare works in general. So we talked a lot about the case itself and sort of her experience as the Chief Justice, what appellate work looks like in the child welfare space and from the judge's position and stuff like that. The clip I chose here is Justice McCormick really just kind of in a more general way describing what she feels is systematically problematic about the way in which the concepts of family separation and reunification are handled within child welfare.
I think that some of the things that are asked of parents are really almost impossible to comply with. I mean, some of the ways in which a set of requests is put together are just not within reach. And it just feels it must be so discouraging to be a parent who is not probably ever going to be able to change, what happened that led her to this place, right? The things that went wrong for this mom long before very big tragedy of losing her infant are part of her. And in some ways, the reasonable efforts standard asks the impossible. It asks parents to, I think I said, get into a time machine and change the past. It just feels a little bit, the ways in which that there are backward looking hoops feels like a setup.
All right, clip number 4 comes from our conversation with Roxana Asgharian, occasional contributor to the Imprint. More importantly for this conversation, author of the tremendous book, We Were Once a Family, A Story of Love, Death, and Child Removal in America, which published in 2023. I won't go into a whole big summary of what the book is about, but you should get the book, buy the book, and read it. In 2018, an adoptive couple, the Harts, who had adopted 2 sets of 3 siblings out of foster care, committed a murder-suicide. They drove their car off a cliff in California, killing themselves and all of the children at the same time. A lot of media attention was paid to that couple and why they did what they did and their history. What Roxana did in this book was really explored the families of these children who lost their tether to them by way of CPS actions in Texas, really in both cases. So in this clip, Roxana is talking about her takeaway of why the state of Texas felt the need to engage first in a removal to stranger foster care for one of these sets of siblings when, there seemed to be some people close to them in their orbit who were willing to step up and care for them and keep them connected to family. And then obviously later put them up and allow them to be adopted from somebody very far away in Minnesota. So here's Roxana Asgharian talking about some of her many takeaways from the work on this book.
I think there's ways that families can be either legible or illegible to the system. For instance, Sherry had a partner who was not the biological dad of the kids, but the kids had lived with him since their birth. He was a sober, stable father figure who cared about them immensely. But it was that's not legible. So, their relationship was unusual, because she was having other partners. And they were who is this guy? And just kind of disregarded him off top.
Clip number 5 comes from our interview with Jeff Fleischer, who, when we interviewed him, was the recently retired CEO of Youth Advocate Programs, or YAP. He had just kind of stepped away from that after several decades. He was going to start up Neighborhood Safety Advocates as sort of an advocacy consulting group. And then plans changed. He became the director of child welfare and juvenile justice for the state of New Hampshire. So that's what he's up to now. I'm realizing as I'm describing these, we caught a lot of people in a career transition phase this year on the podcast. Some retirees like Melissa, some people moving from one job to the next like Jeff or Chief Justice McCormick. So in Jeff's case, now the child welfare / juvenile justice director in New Hampshire. So the clip you're going to hear is from Jeff talking a little bit about what I think the question I had posed to him is, YAP is one of the few national organizations that really operates an alternative to incarceration for youth who, but for that service, would be incarcerated. That's sort of their bread and butter. I know their contracts are probably different from place to place, but their sweet spot is to say, give us the kids that, if we weren't in your area, you would be putting these kids in detention or locking them up. And YAP uses a model that really puts a full-time mentoring person into the lives of young people. So I asked Jeff, been several decades here, there's a lot of attention paid to lowering the reliance on detention and lowering the reliance on incarceration, especially in juvenile justice. So why are there not more peers for YAP? Why are there not more sort of name brand iconic organizations that have popped up to really step in and fill that niche of alternatives to incarceration? So Jeff gave me a pretty good, frank answer in both directions. He sort of first tackled it from the perspective of why does the sort of like mechanics of government sort of tend to favor brick and mortar instead of things like that YAP does. And then he also kind of takes it from the nonprofit side. Why are nonprofits and service providers a little hesitant to kind of dip into that water and really, build out robust alternatives to incarceration? So here's his response.
Why don't more people do this? Two reasons, I think. One is in the systems way, there's still a bias towards taking kids out of the home and putting them away somewhere. And, I don't know, $5 billion that our country spends on just detention or something. So there's still that mentality of we need another detention center. Pennsylvania did that whole reform thing. The assessment was incredible. Most of the kids in Pennsylvania prisons are there for nonviolent crimes, and many for just violations of probation. So the Pennsylvania jails are filled with kids not committing serious crimes. Yet the probation chiefs throughout Pennsylvania are fighting for more detention beds. So there's still this bias that you need, for convenience or whatever it is, you need these detention centers. So as a system, they're still pouring money into edifices, in buildings, et cetera. Now, on the nonprofit side, why aren't more people out there saying, I will take that kid, don't put him in that cage, I will take that young person and work with their family? It's hard work. It's high liability. It's high risk. And if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't have experience in that area with a really tough young person and family that's resistant to services, not amenable to therapy, et cetera, it's scary, and you're not going to get a lot of money for it, So on both sides, the risk, the liability, the danger, the complications, you have to gear your whole organizations to working with these kids. You can't just have a program on the side that says, I'm going to do all this behavioral health work and this mentoring stuff, and then here I'm going to have a tough kid program, because that's never going to get the resources it needs there. So it's just very, very difficult. It can be done. And I think that's what I'd like to do with my next stage of my career, the next chapter, is rather than saying, let's bring YAP into this community, let's help you develop this grassroots in your own community.
All right. So clips 6 and 7 both come from interviews that I did. We ran them back to back because it both featured folks who had just completed, pretty deep dive research projects on the implementation of the Family First Prevention Services Act, particularly around the issue of congregate care. And so basically what the Family First Act did was reined in the availability of federal funding for congregate care, like group homes, residential centers, institutions, basically limited availability of federal funds for that stuff to 2 weeks, with some very notable exceptions. And one of those exceptions is called a Qualified Residential Treatment Program. So if you're accredited as a Qualified Residential Treatment Program, or QRTP, as a new acronym was born into the world, like we needed another one, basically that meant that instead of having that 2-week limit, basically the child welfare system had to keep going back to court, I think every 30 days at first, and then 60, to make the case that to a judge that the placement was still necessary and appropriate. And so if the judge is doing their job, they're reviewing that with scrutiny and making the system take kids out of congregate care when it isn't appropriate. So the first clip you're going to hear, clip 6, is from Carrie Richmond of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Now, she helped lead AAP's sort of 50-state look at implementation on the congregate care limits. And that research included focus groups where they were asking, youth who had experienced congregate care during this time period and leaders at congregate care providers and all kinds of people, for their different perspective. And there was definitely very divergent perspectives, let's put it that way, when it came to these QRTPs, where youth basically said that, it was business as usual and there was really nothing particularly rehabilitative or supportive about them in a way that was different than the other congregate care, and QRTP providers, their leadership, said something entirely different. So in this clip, Carrie is talking a little bit about that.
That was so misaligned, the young people and what the QRTP leadership was saying, and stood out to us as an area where we also need to be cognizant of how are we still supporting young people being in these spaces to help reform these settings and to help them to make the conversion to QRTPs or to keep making the progress towards high quality. So I think those are a couple of our recommendations, is like, what are the standards for youth and family driven QRTP treatment plans? How are you really incorporating them in that process? And then also thinking about how can we set up these sort of advisory committees that are made up of youth and family who can really help these settings to make sure that the outcomes on the back end are matching what these QRTPs are set up to be, which is, again, you're helping treat these young people, helping them heal, and it's high quality and time limited. And does that all match? So I think the other thing too that stood out there is it's just like mental health is such a consistent theme here, and the need for more support services on every level. I think, as my hat of somebody who was personally impacted by the foster care system, but also a professional in this child welfare space, the system's traumatizing for everyone involved. It's traumatizing for young people. It's traumatizing for child welfare professionals. It's traumatizing for foster parents. And so that means that we really do need therapeutic models, trauma-informed staff. And until that matches the people that are supposed to be implementing these changes, if that's misaligned, that is a huge red flag.
All right. So while Carrie and the American Academy of Pediatrics really took a 50-state look at the new federal rules around the Family First Act and group care, Jim Zarniak, who used to lead or help lead Onondaga County's Department of Children and Family Services in New York. Onondaga is where Syracuse is. He is now a consultant, and he worked on some research, particularly about how New York has done with congregate care and with the limits and all of that stuff. So the clip I chose for my interview with Jim it's a little bit of a bank shot on the issue of congregate care. We mostly talked about that, but he also discussed, how Onondaga in particular had come to first formally license and approve more kinship caregivers, which, if you listen to the podcast last week, we're starting to see more and more of the total licensed foster homes in this country be approved kinship caregivers. So he was talking about how in Onondaga County, they made intentional decisions and prioritizations to get more kin, supported in a way where they felt comfortable taking youth in. He's making the point in this clip that, as you start to limit congregate care, that does free up resources for you to do things like prioritize kin. But I would also argue, there's experience shows that kind of the inverse is true as well. Connecticut is a state, by way of example, that dramatically lowered its use of congregate care over the last 10 to 15 years. And, leaders there attribute that to making decisive, intentional moves to place more youth with relatives. And that's certainly not going to be a solve for every single youth. Of course, there are young people who will need some level of residential care at some points, not just youth in foster care, but everywhere. But, as Jim talks about here, this is something they have done to, significantly change the outlay of where young people are living when they're in foster care in Onondaga County. So here's Jim Zarniak.
I'll give you one example in Onondaga. So in Onondaga County, before we started with Family First being released, we had less than 1% of our kids in foster care with a relative who was a certified foster home. And that means a relative who is getting the subsidy, the childcare, the support the regular foster home would. So we had this practice there where we would remove kids and send them to other places in our county with other wonderful families, and we would subsidize and give them support to take care of that kid. We have an opportunity under the law to certify a grandmother, a grandfather, an aunt, uncle, a coach, and place the child with them and give them that same subsidy. So in Onondaga County, before Family First, we had less than 1% of those kinship arrangements. The investments we started making were really intentionally doing more upfront work, looking for families and expediting a training program for families so they could get through the training quickly, providing direct resources. We had a triage team, we call it. It was a specific team that when a kid was at risk of removal, we would send out to look for family, look for fathers sides of the family, and provide that sort of hurdle help support to get them through the licensing. There's a lot of red tape, right? So we have to get through the licensing, get the payments going. So we make that real investment. And now Onondaga has any month of the year, over 40% of their kids in foster care are now with relatives. And so what New York State did is New York State also provided a lot of language and guidance about how to go about doing that. So families can have more rights also to understand what they can do and what they can't do. So like they can advocate to have their own children. They can advocate for subsidy. They can advocate to become a foster home. So really what we did is we sort of raised the awareness among the counties, help them identify plans in which they could go seek out more kin, and then look at that investment and saying, if you're reducing that really expensive back end congregate costs, you could have some funding that could go into supporting your family to take care of their own youth. And the benefit for that, kids were able to stay in their own school district. There was somebody they're very familiar with. Many of them have increased chances to visit with their family members because they're with family. A lot of those cultural things stay in place. So once we started doing it, it really took off. And then we obviously hit a pandemic, which sort of impacted that momentum a little bit. And we can talk about that with the report too. But those are some of the changes that were made in New York to really support getting kids with their families and really focusing on reducing the number of kids that are in foster care, because especially congregate care, because we don't have any beds. That's the thing that's most sad about this whole problem is so many kids are in these settings in group care because we can't find a bed. It's not because they need the types of services they provide. It's because we just need a place for them to be. And so this kingship work was really important to open up those foster homes now to take those types of kids. And that was sort of the lovely relationship we saw and the progress we saw across the state.
Clip number 8 comes from my joint conversation with Christopher Church, who is a lot of different things, but he's a pro bono attorney for the Champs Clinic at the University of South Carolina School of Law, co-director for the Appeal for Youth Clinic at Emory Law in Atlanta. So it's him and Vivek Sankaran, who's an occasional columnist for the Imprint. He runs the Child Advocacy Law Clinic and Child Welfare Appellate Clinics at the University of Michigan. So those two gentlemen wrote The Ties That Bind, which is a recent law journal article that kind of lays out 3 different arguments against the rate at which many child welfare systems terminate parental rights. So you can listen to the whole conversation if you want to deep dive into that. The clip I picked out from this interview is Christopher talking about, I don't know how to describe this well. Basically what he's getting at here is the way that court professionals and child welfare people talk about the future and possibilities for youth who are in foster care and their families versus how you would actually communicate with human beings like their relatives, for example. And that's what he's talking about in this clip. So give it a listen.
This is all highlighting something that I keep coming back to, which is we have to start prioritizing people and not dispositions. We are talking right now way in the weeds about adoption versus guardianship. And that's the problem. When we start talking about who can care for this child, I'm working on an appeal right now where the moment the children entered care, the permanency plan was reunification, concurrent with guardianship, concurrent with adoption. And I'm reading these hearing transcripts where they're going through reasonable efforts for every one of them. What are you doing for reunification? What are you doing for guardianship? What are you doing for adoption? Are the relative caregivers interested in guardianship? Are they interested in adoption? And it's like, Who talks like that? Like, if I went on a first date with my wife and was like, "Are you interested in marriage? Or are you interested in a domestic partnership?" Right? Like, I like you, and I want to continue to get to know you. And ultimately, if we secure our relationship in a legal way, I trust that we'll figure that out and work it out. And it's the same thing. We've got people in a courtroom who care deeply about a child, full stop. How do we support them?
All right. Clip number 9 comes from Sarita Cox, co-founder of iFoster. They do all sorts of support type things for both transition age foster youth and for foster parents. Help start, really the first AmeriCorps program dedicated to transition age youth in the foster care system. So in this interview, we're actually talking about something they have recently added to their plate at iFoster, which is sort of an annual survey of the foster care community. They call it the voice of the foster care community. They survey youth in the system, caseworkers, social workers, resource parents, biological parents, really get a sense of how people are feeling about different services and different parts of the system, basically. So what she's talking about in the clip that I am going to play for you is the fairly surprising finding that when you ask older youth who are in foster care, a very high percentage of them do not express seeking reunification or finalized adoptions as something they're particularly interested in or view as a priority. So Sarita kind of talks about how she was surprised at that at first, but sort of in thinking about those responses in the context of other things that they gleaned from the survey, how it made a ton of sense. So here is Sarita Cox.
So for a hot minute, it was like, whoa, because child welfare, even if you go to Children's Bureau website, it will say child welfare's goal is reunification, right? So you immediately have this visceral reaction. At least I did when I saw the data. And then I thought about it for another couple minutes and went, you know what? This is not surprising to me, because the young people who answered the survey are between the ages of 16 and early 20s. And so they've been around the block a few times in the child welfare world. So their answers may be different than if you went younger. And really, it's not that they don't want a family. That's not the issue. It's not that they don't want to have a relationship with their family. And in actual fact, there was another stat that said that the majority of youth, even those aging out, had interactions with their family. They were in contact with their family. The issue is that many of them, not all of them, but many of them who had this viewpoint had been through the bounce back cycle through reunification. It had been attempted and it failed. And they had bounced back into the system sometimes multiple times. And the issue at hand was that the family was not stable enough, was not ready for them to come back. Yes, there were some extreme cases where it was just not a good mix and it should never happen. But in the majority of cases, the family hadn't got the stabilization that it needed, which goes back to why they were removed in the first place. It was poverty, it was stressors, it was substance abuse, and those underlying things had not been solved by the time reunification happened. And that's truly the issue. That's the first point. Then the second point is youth were very much about that exiting foster care to independence shouldn't be looked as something bad. It's actually a good thing. And youth want to be self-sufficient. Even those youth who are reunified or find permanency would like to have the skills to be self-sufficient because they're young adults. And at some point, they are going to be on their own. Whether they go through a family or not, they're going to have to grow up and be adults. So this notion of having self-sufficiency as a concrete pathway that is just as viable as other pathways and is a choice for youth to make is, I think, very, very significant.
All right, clip number 10 comes from the episode that we posted just a few days after the very stunning and surprising 7-2 Supreme Court decision in Brackeen v. Haaland, which was a case over the constitutionality of the Indian Child Welfare Act. So that is something that we spent quite a bit of time talking about on this podcast, and Nancy Marie Spears on our team here at the Imprint reported the heck out of that case and everything ICWA in 2023. So I'll drop a link in the show notes for this best of, to where you can go and read up if you actually missed all that. In this podcast, we sort of broke down the decision and sort of what was said in the opinion first, and then we went to 3 experts that we had talked to several times each, really, as this case went from kind of a district court thing in 2018 all the way until the final decision. So we talked to Kate Fort, who's at Michigan State University, one of the foremost experts on ICWA in the country, Chrissy Ross-Nemo, who's the Deputy Attorney General for Cherokee Nation, and then Rebecca Nagel, who's a journalist and architect of the podcast This Land. And the second season of This Land was just an incredible breakdown of the Brett Keane case, tying it to other, issues with Indian law as well. So as I said, I mean, it was a very surprising decision. There was a range of predictions out there, I think, before the Supreme Court, announced its opinion in Brett Keane. But they really ranged from, I think the Supreme Court is going to essentially gut ICWA, to, I think they will tinker with it but change it. I don't really think anybody had the prediction out in public that this was going to be a vociferous, commitment to ICWA by the vast majority of the justices. So in this clip, you're going to hear Rebecca Nagel really just kind of reflect on the decision and how the many people that she was in touch with and in contact with after that Supreme Court decision came out were feeling about everything.
I think that people are just relieved. Like, I think that there's just this extreme sense of relief. I think people were really, really worried about some worst case scenarios. I think a lot of people are, like what we talked about at the beginning, just wasn't what people were expecting, which is sad. It's like, you look at the Constitution and court precedent, it should have been, even just the rules of civil procedure and how standing works, it should have been the obvious outcome. But I think people didn't trust the Supreme Court to get to this place. And so I think that's the main thing that I'm hearing. When I was at oral arguments, I think a lot of Native leaders and people who are there to defend ICWA, I think it's very emotional to have a case where Native kids are on the line, Native families are on the line, and then it's wrapped up into this broader attack on tribal sovereignty. And I think it pulls up a lot of trauma for people because we've been through that like so many times before. And so I think people are catching their breath from it coming close, but from it ultimately not working.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. And then when we come back, we'll do the next 10 clips in the best of episode for the Imprint Weekly Podcast 2023.
Hi, everyone. It's journalist Lisa Ling, and I'm sure you will agree that it is so important for there to be good, trustworthy journalism on children and families, and nobody does that better than the Imprint. I am such a devotee of the Imprint, and I listen to the Imprint Weekly Podcast because it is so comprehensive and so substantive, and it is by far the best news source for anyone interested in critical issues like foster care, juvenile justice, youth homelessness, and so much more. During this holiday season of giving, I hope you'll consider donating to the Imprint. If you do so between now and the end of the year, your donation will be doubled thanks to the National Newsmatch campaign. To give is so easy. Go to imprintnews.org/donate. That's imprintnews.org/donate. Thank you so much.
All right, let's get back to it. These are the next 10 clips, best of episode, Imprint Weekly Podcast 2023. Clip 11 comes from our interview with Daryl Missy, who is the relatively new director of the Missouri Children's Division. Mr. Missy has quite the interesting story. He was born to a family that, by his own recollection and reflection, was kind of a case in point, classic family that could have ended up really ensnared in the child welfare system. His mom experienced very serious mental health issues. And as an attorney, he had a real problem with the way that at least the county that he was in was operating the child welfare system. So he ran to be a judge and ran basically on a child welfare reform platform and won. So he was a longtime judge in Missouri. He was basically poised to move to Florida upon retirement from that position with his family. And kind of at the last minute, the new governor in Missouri kind of begged him to to come on and lead the system. And so he did take that on. In this clip, just to set up a little context for it, as we reported at the Imprint in 2023, the Biden administration has finalized some new rules that are basically have been put in place to help states establish a different path to approving and licensing kin than they would for, their stable of non-relative foster caregivers or traditional, foster parents that you would think of. And then also to make clear that those approved kin, even if they're on a different sort of approval pathway, can be supported with federal funding. So I asked Director Missy whether he felt that these new rules, which at the time were just proposed, they've been finalized since this interview, whether he thought that they would have an impact in Missouri. And he said, in fact, that he believed they'd have a big impact, and then explained why.
I think it will help, John, because when they're talking about licensure, right? They're talking about should we have a different standard of licensure for a grandmother than you have for a stranger? As the idea that we don't is a real problem, because it is a totally different thing to have, a child placed with grandma and not with it. Well, for example, let's take criminal history. Grandma did some wild things in the 1970s. Okay. Now
who didn't in the 70s?
Right. It was the 1970s. And so she's got some criminal history. And now grandma is a 60-something-year-old, a cobbler baking, quilt knitting, member of the church choir. And now grandma's still not fit because she's got this serious thing that happened in 1978, and it's like, well, wait a minute. Does that make any sense? But what I would do, John, and the reason my numbers were different is I did not care about Children's Division's licensure. I did not care what some bureaucrat told me was or was not appropriate or fit or anything else. My concern was for that child and that family, and where is that child's heart and mind? And if Aunt Susie happens to have a misdemeanor marijuana offense from a float trip she took on the Merrimack River in 1992, that is not going to stop me from placing this child who loves her with her when it's completely safe to do it.
All right. The next two clips come from a series we did over the summer on the podcast called Safe Camp Spotlights. And so in case you didn't know, we at the Fostering Media Connections launched Safe Camp Audio, which is a podcast network. So, of course, the Imprint Weekly Podcast is part of that. But in year one of launching this audio network, what we were really trying to do was bring together podcasts in this space of child welfare and youth justice, although there really aren't any youth justice podcasts yet. We're going to be working on that in 2024. But really taking people who are already doing interesting stuff in this space and seeing if we created a network, would that help them? Could we be a rising tide to get more attention, paid to these people doing really great work? So we launched the network with that in mind as kind of an early goal. Could we be sort of a hub for really great audio work and audio projects on these issues? So anyway, over the summer, Safe Camp Spotlights, we basically brought in the host of each one of the shows that's on the Safe Camp Audio Network and interviewed them, just both, in general about their views on child welfare and then also about their podcast in particular. So I picked two of those shows to feature here, although they were all great interviews. I really think just every one of the podcasts that's on the network is a really awesome one, and they just all have killer hosts. So the first clip I'm going to play here is from my interview with Adrian McLemore, and Adrian was one of the founding organizers of the Unbelievably Resilient podcast, which, is comprised entirely of young adults who experience foster care, and it's a safe space to discuss and, get into the weeds on their experience and stories of resilience. So it's been a great podcast. As I talked to Adrian about during this interview, I really felt like this season of it, season 3 of Unbelievably Resilient, to my mind, is probably the single strongest audio project on child welfare that I'm aware of, at least in terms of like a continuing, episodic show like theirs. So anyway, in this clip, as well as the next clip I'm going to play, both cases, one of the last questions I asked to most of the hosts when I was doing this was, what are you pessimistic and what are you optimistic about in terms of the future of child welfare. So in this clip, you're going to hear Adrian talk about both. He's going to start with what he is pessimistic about and then move to optimism.
So I'll start with the pessimistic version first, and then I'll end with the optimism. The most pessimistic version that I have of the child welfare system, that we still, in a lot of areas, still do it the same way that we've always done it. And, that old quote, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. A lot of times I feel that way about child welfare in terms of how we engage birth families, in terms of how we focus on making sure that young people are prepared for adulthood, especially in our opportunity range ages of, at 14 teenage years before they get ready to leave the system. We still have dismal results when it comes to young people aging out of the foster care system. So that's the pessimistic side of it. What I'm optimistic about is I continue to see, not just in this life of podcasting, but also in my day-to-day life as a professional in the field, is I continue to see that there are more and more advocacy groups popping up, that there are more and more people who are willing to share their story, that there are more and more people willing to work on policy reform and change, and there are more and more people who are getting in the field who have lived experience, which I believe is critically important to changing how we think about child welfare. You have folks who have gone through the system who are now working their way through the ranks of becoming social workers, who are working their ranks to becoming executives in child welfare, who are working their way through becoming policymakers in the child welfare space. So I'm optimistic about that aspect of it, and that the system, hopefully over the long term, begins to produce better outcomes.
All right, now in clip 13, I interviewed one of our Safe Camp podcast hosts, and her name is Ivory Bennett. And since we've done that interview, Ivory Bennett has become the program director of Youth Voices Rising here at Fostering Media Connections. So I get to work with her on a daily basis. And I'm just lucky enough to have dinner with her and a few of our other colleagues in Pittsburgh, where she lives, just a few weeks before you're hearing this. So interestingly, Ivory launched her podcast before we brought her in to lead Youth Voices Rising. So at the time that we were doing the Safe Camp Spotlight, her show is called Ivory Bennett, the Podcast. Obviously, she's certainly free to do that show as well, but you can look for in 2024 for a Youth Voices Rising podcast coming out of the Safe Camp Audio Network, and Ivory will certainly be leading that charge for us. So anyway, in this clip, she is talking about one of the points of great concern for her in terms of advocacy around child welfare and foster care.
I am most concerned about us putting youth impacted by care into boxes. There's not only one way to success. There's not only one way to healing. There's not only one way to overcoming the trauma of being in child welfare. And I'm concerned that these narratives that we create, the people who we pick to put on platforms and to speak as national representatives of child welfare experiences, represent a very specific demographic of people, a very specific idea of success. And I would like to normalize that there is an expansiveness to success. There's an expansiveness to overcoming and to rising above adversity. And so I get concerned when I see only one type or two types or three types, the archetypes of the national representatives of people who were in care or are in care. And I would really love to hold space for and create seats at the table for those who don't fit those archetypes.
All right, clip number 14 comes from our conversation with Kathy Eisenhower, co-founder and CEO of Shields for Family, which is based in Los Angeles. Kathy, along with some compatriots, founded Shields 3 decades ago against the backdrop of the crack epidemic there in Los Angeles. So she started Shields basically out of a rundown trailer provided by the Los Angeles County government. And she did that with Norma Ntume and Dr. Exelina Bean. Shields has really become a pioneering organization in the fight to, keep families together while parents pursue meaningful drug treatment. So given Kathy's, decades long commitment to working to keep those families together, one of the things that I posed to her in this very long interview that we had was my thought that, probably the last thing she wants to talk about is when it would be appropriate for a child welfare agency to come in and remove kids due to drug use. But I think it's, I think that discussion is best informed by people who are just hell-bent and working out there every day to keep families together. So she was nice enough to answer that annoying question from me. Here's her thoughts on, the circumstances when that would be warranted. I know that your work and your career has been focused fiercely on keeping families together whenever possible,
Yes.
But you've worked on the DCFS side, you've worked for CPS, you've done this work for 30 years. So I think your answer is an important perspective to hear on this. When in your mind is it appropriate for an agency to remove a child as a direct result of a parent's drug use? Like, what needs to be present for you to say that that's a valid thing to do?
When you cannot step in and mitigate the risk to the child. I mean, number one, in my mind, there has to be some risk of significant harm to that child in order to remove it, and no ability to put a plan in place that would mitigate those risks in any way. If a parent is using and that child is left at risk and they're refusing to access resources, again, it's a hard question to answer because there are so many individual factors. So when I'm saying you can't put a plan in place, that there's no kin available, there's no, other significant other in the picture, there's no way to make sure that child is safe, then I think it's appropriate. But I probably have seen that situation no more than a handful of times over the 30 years where there could not be something put in place.
All right, the next clip comes from our conversation with Christine Norbert-Beyer, who is the commissioner of the New Jersey Department of Children and Families. She's worked, with and around the child welfare system in New Jersey for most of her career. And the state, so what we talked about, as a kind of starting off point before we got into other stuff was, now the state of New Jersey has recently exited court oversight after having been under, the thumb of the federal courts for quite a while. I'm not sure exactly how many years, but it was a lot. Certainly almost all of Christine's career. So one question I asked her was around, how they were able to achieve that exit after so many years. And so basically what I asked her was, whether she felt like the benchmarks and the agreements, that came out of the lawsuit that led to court oversight were the reason for success in New Jersey, or whether or not, the fact that the state has dramatically lowered the number of youth in their foster care system played a bigger role in getting to a place where, they were competent enough that the court looked at it and said, okay, you guys are good to go on your own. I think I was a little more articulate about this when I asked her, and she was certainly more articulate in her response. So give a listen. Kind of a chicken and egg question here. Mm-hmm. Did New Jersey get to where they could exit the lawsuit by reducing its use of foster care, or did the requirements of the lawsuit lead to the reduction in foster care?
I would say the first. I don't think the elements of the lawsuit led to a reduction. I think maybe early on initially, but, we were hovering at that 6,000, 7,000 mark of kids in care for a pretty long period of time where, it started slowing down. And I think, some of that was because we were able to do better work, right? You have lower caseloads, you can pay more attention. We did implement a practice model in 2006, 2007. We did reduce and really eliminate the use of congregate care in the mid 2000s for children under the age of 13, and then really did a lot of work on building out the children's system of care. That took a lot of kids also out of foster care because, originally, and I think it happens in many other states still, you have to enter the child welfare system in order to access behavioral health services and congregate services. That changed in New Jersey. So that took a whole portion of kids right off the top from entering care.
Clip number 16 comes from our interview with Jody Kent-Levy, another career transitioner we interviewed. She was the co-executive director of the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, which is really kind of the premier national organization fighting juvenile life without parole sentencing. You'll often hear that referred to as JLWOP. And, the Supreme Court had for a time really been kind of steadily through different opinions, kind of eating into, the circumstances where youth could, first they banned the death penalty for youth, and then banned the issuance of juvenile life without parole in non-homicides. And then it cut it back to where you couldn't have like an automatic sentencing structure where youth received jail WAP sentences. So, the campaign has been kind of the premier organization working on that. And Jody was the first executive director. She's still with the organization, still working with them, just stepped out of that top spot. So in this clip, Jody is reflecting on the fact that there was recently a major achievement announced by the campaign that since their founding, 1,000 people who had been convicted to a juvenile life without parole sentence as children had been freed. And that was all due to different changes brought on by the Supreme Court decisions and changes in state law. So this is Jody Kent-Levy talking a little bit about that achievement.
Many of them are people, I remember writing to over the years, and at a time when there was just so little hope, and the idea that now they're free and they're with their loved ones, it's just unbelievable. And there are still many of them behind the wall. Either they've been resentenced to something else and they're getting, denied parole because the parole boards haven't been changed enough. There's just so many things that I think this issue, again, sort of going back to where we started, this issue highlights so many problems with our system and remains, somehow our country can stomach the idea that we condemn children to die in prison, and we're the only country in the world that does this. So that to me is continuing to drive me in the work, because I feel like we're better than that, and we have to be. And as long as this barbaric sentence exists, it's Black and brown children who are disproportionately going to get it, and continues to rationalize a punitive system across the board that serves none of us.
Okay, clip 17 came from episode 150 of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I had Dawn Post on for that episode. Dawn has done all kinds of stuff in her career, which began as a teenager, where she was a lawyer as a teenager, successfully argued a case, which is a crazy story that you can hear if you listen to the entire interview. I didn't know that about her until she told me. In the clip that I'm going to play from our interview, so she started up when she was with Lawyers for Children in New York City, the Broken Adoptions Project. And she was really ahead of an issue that I think is going to, become front and center here. There was huge USA Today, investigation that was published this year that really looked into the frequency with which adoptions fail and youth end up coming back into foster care. Basically the findings were that, in the entire aggregate, it's a pretty low percentage outcome, but it happens quite frequently to older youth in particular. So anyway, Dawn, when she was a lawyer for kids in New York City, founded the Broken Adoptions Project, really as a way to fight for youth who had experienced this, fallen out of adoptive placements back into foster care or into homelessness. And also they did some of the earliest research that I'm aware of on, what exactly states were doing in terms of post-adoption spending and investing in post-adoption supports. Spoiler alert, not much at the time. So Dawn was just kind of talking a little bit about that experience with the Broken Adoptions Project and, her observations on why adoptions fail in a way where it does not seem like we are prepared or equipped to prevent that.
Quality therapeutic interventions is a big one.
Yeah.
I refer to it as the Medicaid mills in terms of an evolving set of new mental health providers that are not necessarily providing really intensive or appropriate treatment. And so I think that intervention could be hugely helpful. But it's amazing around the country talking to people, how few people, they're so reliant on the agencies to solve their problems. As a foster parent, the agency makes all the decisions. You turn to the agency when you need assistance. And how many people don't know what's available and may not have the tech skills or even be that familiar with the internet to, if they're an older adoptive parent, how many, just didn't even know who to call or who to access. And that's why it's important that even workers were not well trained around it. And we saw a lot of circumstances in the small study that we did where adoptive parents had come forward and asked for help, but rather than put in any help, they simply just replaced the child back into foster care. Really? And so that seemed really amazing to me, because out of all the cases, because there's certain financial streams where therapeutic interventions could have been provided, but they weren't, and they were simply just brought back into care.
All right, home stretch here. We got 3 more clips to play you from the Best of Imprint Weekly Podcast 2023. This one comes from our interview with Natalice Washington, who is the policy counsel for the National Association of Counsel for Children. She leads the organization's campaign to get all 50 states to guarantee legal counsel to all children in foster care. So we talked a lot about that campaign and what has worked and what's been effective in it. In this clip, Natalice is talking about something that was relatively new to me, which is this concept of substituted judgment as sort of a philosophy, I guess, or a guiding principle on how best to represent children in foster care who are younger, maybe cannot articulate their wishes or make those judgments for themselves. You'll typically hear that more described as like a best interest argument. And so Natalice is kind of differentiating here what the concept of substituted judgment is as compared to best interest representation.
So the role of the attorney is really to cover all those bases. And how we do it is by stepping into the shoes of the child and trying to determine what that child would want if they could talk to us. And we do that through this mechanism of investigation where we're talking to collaterals. We're talking to the service providers that service that child, whether they're health, mental health, collaterals, neighbors, pre-K school teachers, anybody who has awareness of that child and could speak to what that child needs or that child's experience in the community that could help inform us. What we do in substituted judgment is different than what we do in a best interest sort of scenario where we kind of look at all of the facts of the case and through our own lens determine what we think is best for that child. The substituted judgment model aims to eliminate that opportunity for bias. And that bias could come through in a best interest determination as we filter information through what we think is best. When we use substituted judgment, we're really aiming to investigate objectively the facts and choose the goals that that child would choose if they could.
Clip number 19 from our conversation with Carrie Lohnard. Carrie is the child advocate for the state of Kansas. We had her on because her office did a really interesting survey. They went out and tried to learn from foster parents who had left them, basically had stopped fostering in the state of Kansas. So the survey was meant to kind of try to glean some information about why people made the decision to stop fostering. And this was kind of prompted from a period of time, starting around COVID or right after COVID, where they experienced a very large, net loss of foster homes in Kansas. So in the clip here, you're going to hear Carrie talking about one of the findings that most surprised, I guess, or maybe one of the findings that most concerned her in what they heard back from these former foster parents.
I think that the finding, which I found probably personally the most interesting, was the number of homes that left that were willing to take our older youth. And we know that that's the age that our older youth are really the ones that we are struggling the most, that have the mental health and externalizing behaviors that we're having a hard time maintaining placement stability. So knowing that we have this large group that we're leaving, that we're willing to take our older youth, and what is it that we need to bridge then to keep those families? A lot of it has to do with the communication and what information is being provided to our families. And then correlated with that is what level of support and training are they being provided? And then the opportunity to meet that youth's needs. So mental health services in Kansas, we struggle. And so our families are not getting the support that they need to meet the youth that are placed in their home.
All right, time for our final clip. We counted down 20 of the best clips from interviews this year on the Imprint Weekly Podcast 2023. This one comes from an interview just a few weeks back that we did with Lisa Dixon of Action Ohio. We ended up talking about all things Ohio on this interview, but the reason I had Lisa on originally was because as many people know, the holidays can be a particularly tough time for youth who have experienced foster care, and her and a bunch of folks in Ohio have really committed to and continue to organize an annual series of Thanksgiving dinners around the state for youth who are in Ohio's foster care system. So I had her on to just talk about the experience. She was kind enough to let me actually come down to Columbus, Ohio. I don't live too far away, and observe one of the Thanksgiving dinners and be part of it. But she just broke down with me how to do something like that, how to build a tradition that is meaningful and safe and supportive for youth who are in foster care. In the clip here, you're going to hear her talking about a new wrinkle that they had added, this family tree concept to the Thanksgiving dinner this year, and sort of what it meant to her and to foster youth who attended.
I liked that we had the family tree and they could write their name down and iron themselves onto our fabric family tree. And that just started this year because we wanted a signature way to really share the event. And when I looked back at the leaves that people wrote, some people wrote during the Columbus dinner, "I am thankful for my chosen family." And then one person wrote, "You are worthy of love, not for your doing. You are worthy of love simply because of your being." And I think for foster youth, it doesn't feel like that for us. We can be rejected from a foster home. We can age out and become homeless. Yeah. We could be in an extended foster care program and mess up and get kicked out. After we're disconnected from systems, no one's calling to ask how we're doing. So part of the Thanksgiving dinners is this is an annual check where you get to say, "Oh my gosh, I see you. You're becoming such a great parent. You are the parent you never had. I see you. You're graduating from college."
All right, that is a wrap on 2023 for the Imprint Weekly Podcast. Thanks to all of our guests who came on, all the reporters at the Imprint who do great stuff that I can talk about all the time on the podcast. And then thanks, as always, to my wizard of a producer, Christina Anjoko. And thanks to Foster Power, a movement to improve the lives and futures of youth in foster care by creating access to information on their benefits, protections, and legal rights. They are the sponsor of this episode of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christina Anjoko with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elia. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow the Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @theimprintnews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. And you can always email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly. Happy New Year, and we'll see you in 2024.